How many of you have read Too Close to the Falls? Okay, right. So some haven't. So I'm going to just sort of get you up to speed because I'm going to talk today about the third volume. But you really need to know a little bit about what made me the person I am and whatever. So the first volume was called Too Close to the Falls, and it was about my life from the age of 4 to 14. So what happened was my parents, who were in their 40s, didn't have any children, or as my mother said, they were not blessed. And then I came along, and my mother said that I was not the child they'd expected. They obviously expected someone quite different. So I began climbing trees. I saw a cat up a tree when I was 4, and the fire department came and got that cat out, and I really liked the whole thing. The red truck, I liked all of it. So I took to climbing trees, and then the fire department would have to come and get me down because I couldn't get down. So the fire department got sick of it all and said, okay, we are not going to do this again, and she has to get medical help. Right? So, I mean, medical help in 1953 that's a big thing to say. I mean, now you get psychiatric help for anything, right? So my mother took me to the pediatrician, and he said, well, she has a different metronome from other people. And I think I was jumping off his table as well, setting those kind of tongue depressors, like farther and farther away and doing the broad jump. Now, I did wind up being Western New York's high jump champion, so I think I was always doing a jumping thing. I was in preparation, right? But anyway, he said, no, he said, she's got a different metronome, and my diagnosis is that she has to work full time. So my mother, this is the 50s. You believe everything the doctor says. There's no such thing as second opinion, right? That didn't come around until the 70s or 80s. So my mother went home and said to my father, who owned a drugstore in Niagara Falls and a surgical supply thing and some other things, said, unfortunately, Kathy has to work full time. So my father said, really? Who do you think is going to hire a 4-year-old? Right? I mean, like, how many people do you know have 4-year-old employees? Right? So she said, well, I don't know. That's what the doctor said. So he said, okay, obviously I'm going to have to hire her because no one else is. So he said, it's not such a bad thing. Anyway, he had a black delivery car driver named Roy who didn't read. He never learned how to read. And once in a while he would screw up the deliveries of the, this is the era of the 50s when everything got delivered. Do you remember the 50s when everything got delivered, dry cleaning, whatever? So we delivered, tons and tons of stuff. So he said, you're going to have to teach her, meaning me, how to read, which is easy because, my mother had 8 hours a day to do it, and she was a teacher by training rather than inclination. She was a math teacher, but she only taught for one day. So the reason she only taught for one day, I asked her, and she said because she didn't know she'd have to teach children. So she taught me how to read, and I went to work. I mean, it was a perfect arrangement because Roy had a driver's license, and I knew how to read. So it was, it worked, and I went from 6 o'clock in the morning till 10 at night, and my sort of whatever my hyperactivity was, I didn't have time for it anymore, right? So it worked really well. Now, interestingly enough, this is just an aside, I was in Lewiston, New York, giving this talk, which is right where I grew up, and the doctor who made this diagnosis was actually there. He's like in his 90s, with a walker. And so I said, what possessed you to say I had a different metronome? I mean, you set me off on a really unusual course. And he said that it was the era of thalidomide. They didn't want to give any girls medication because of what had happened with the thalidomide babies. So, there were people in the audience that he prescribed, all boys, from big families where the mothers had said, I can't take this kid another second if I, whatever. So they had phenobarbital, and they said they would see themselves in pictures and not even remember being in that picture, right? They missed their whole childhood, right? But for a girl, he said he didn't want to go there. So that's how the whole thing kind of started out. And so my life was unusual in the sense that I didn't spend that much time with my mother. I spent a lot of time with my father and most of my time with Roy. So some people thought my parents were neglectful. I didn't see it that way, but sometimes you write a book and then people, I talk at book groups or wherever, people see my parents in a completely different light than I thought I was portraying them, which is something we might want to talk about later, about how you portray someone and then they're interpreted completely differently. But I thought that working and delivering drugs was actually fabulous for your self-confidence, because when you deliver drugs, people are happy to see you. Right? Mothers would open the door, that had 8 children. This is before birth control really took hold, especially in Irish Catholic families, right? So they would open the door and they'd go, "My Valium!" or somebody would be in insulin shock and they'd say, "Oh, my insulin." So people were always happy to see you. And the other thing is I really got to see the world. You know how people really only see their socioeconomic bracket, because that's what we do, right? We live in neighborhoods where everybody can, afford the exact same kind of house that we can afford. You can still do that today. But I was really lucky because I got to spend time with, the owner of DuPont Nylon was, the DuPont mansion was there, and that was, interesting. And we also delivered to all the prostitutes of the town because they need antibiotics, right? So, I really got to see, and whenever, this is the era when you delivered something, it was considered rude not to invite people in. You always said, "Come on in and have one for the cold, Roy," right? And so, he'd have maybe by the end of the day, 10 for the cold, right? And, and I would get a hot chocolate or whatever. So I sort of got to meet everyone in the town and spend time with them. And that, I think, was probably one of the best things in the world for me, to do. And it was, so the book winds up being, I think, quite cheerful. Although when I go to book clubs, people say I felt sorry for you, so I don't know, I don't get it. But let me move on to that's something that we can talk about in the question and answer period, because the tone sometimes is misinterpreted in books. Now, the second book I wrote was called After the Falls, and this is me from 14 to 21. And this book is a lot darker. And some people have said to me, "Well, why did you write, this book is so dark compared to the last one?" And I said, "Well, when you write a memoir, you actually have to follow what happened in your life." And they said, "Well, I don't know. It could have been more cheerful." And I find that interesting, because one of the reasons I like writing nonfiction and why I like writing memoir is because you can follow the arc of your life, and the story is pretty well organized. All you have to do is write it. Right? I've also written fiction and gotten lost in details and subplots, and this one is, you just like, well, this happened. So when I was 14, my father, we had to sell the drugstore because it was the era of big drugstores, the Shoppers Drug Mart, all of those kinds of chain stores, and the era of delivering medication and offering all of those things were gone. So, and Niagara Falls basically died as a city. It's a long story, it'll come out in the book. But my father, we moved to Buffalo, and I was delivering medication one day across the street, and I noticed that all the pills were different in the vial, like they were, and I looked them up in the drug compendium, and they weren't all ampicillin as it said on the label. And I thought, wow, this is scary. So I went to my father and I said, "These are not all ampicillin. What's the problem here?" And he said, "Oh, I know, but hold it up to the," I named the chapter "A Vial in the Sunlight," because he said, "Hold the vial up to the sunlight and then shake it. It's really, really pretty." So, I see you're looking at me the way I looked at him. So I thought, wow. My mother said, "Well, he's having a bad day. Just ignore that." I said, "No, you can't ignore this. This is medication. It can kill people, right?" So I called the doctor, the GP, and I said, "You've got to come over right away." And he did, and so, he said, did one of these things with the pen, "Can you see here?" He could only see about that much, and he had a really large brain tumor. So then my life changed dramatically, and I then had to be in charge of our home. And it's really hard when someone is psychotic, but they can walk and talk. And he still went to work. He was a drug researcher, and he went to work for, 6 years before he died. And I called them in the 5th year and said, "You do know that he's making no sense at all. Like, are you on to that? When he's researching stuff?" And they said, No, they had no idea. They thought he was perfectly okay. Right? So I said, he works alone, but someone said, "Yeah, he was a little odd, Like, people said, "Yeah, he was a bit odd." So I thought, well, that's drug research for you, I guess, right? Wow. Anyway, so I then went off to college, but I had to, take his car keys from him. I had to, have his assets frozen, all of those things. That's a hard thing in a relationship with a mother and a father. It's painful to do that because he has short-term memory loss. So every morning he wakes up and says, I'm off to work. And, I had to say, you're not going to work. You have a brain tumor. You can't go to work. And so he would say to my mother, what is with her? Why is she saying this? Because he would forget as soon as you said it. My mother knew much more how to handle him. She said, oh no, Jim, the most terrible thing has happened. Irv Weinstein of WGR News said that no Irish Catholics can drive the car until the war in Vietnam is over. And so he said, well, that's ridiculous. Okay, well, here are my car keys. I guess you'll have to drive me. So it was like they had some kind of relationship where they were able to kind of work things out, where I just would say, try to say, well, you have a brain tumor. That didn't work. That just didn't go anywhere. But anyway, I went off to college, and at college, I became really involved in civil rights. There's two trains of thought here, but I don't want to spend too much time on that. But with the civil rights thing, I got involved in the Black Panther breakfast program, and then there was a murder in the Black Panther breakfast program, and then we were all investigated for this murder, and then my college was closed for graduation because of riots, which they sort of thought was my fault. Oops. And so it was kind of a bad time. Now, previous to this, my father had said that I had to go to college to be either a teacher or a nurse. I don't know, did any of you go through this where your father said you had to be a teacher or a nurse? Oh, you're nodding. Good. I'm glad I'm not the only one. He lived through through the Depression, and he said, you're not the marrying kind. You've never even had a date. Let's face it, you argue with men all the time. You're not marrying, so you've got to have a job, right? And it can't be one of these like artsy kind of jobs where you get a BA. No way, I'm not paying for it. You have to be a nurse or a teacher. So my mother, I thought, was coming to my behalf and said, well, she can't be a nurse. She's got white hair and white skin, and she'd have to wear a white outfit, and she'd be totally washed out. Unacceptable. She cannot do that, right? So that left teaching, right? So I thought, well, I guess I'll have to take this teaching course. But then I decided, I do have a lot of energy, so I think I'll do a double major, and I took the sciences as well. But then, there have been some problems, and while I was doing this, the FBI came to investigate me in my home in Buffalo. And they came to the door one day, and because of this Black Panther thing, and there's going to be a murder trial, and because of my work with you have no idea how much civil rights movement with CIA had infiltrated that. It's unbelievable, right? But so while there, my father, he got a kind of connection between CIA, or the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. Right, because he knew that he had that in his brain, even though his brain was gone. So he said Hoover. So he got out our vacuum cleaner, which was a Hoover, right, and showed the people from the FBI and the FBI all of the parts of our vacuum, every single part. So I think the FBI thought we had enough problems, really. So other than whatever. So they left, and. But that was a little bit scary because, I still had trouble going across borders and things like that. So when I was at school, I had to do, when I was doing this double major, I kind of got behind the 8 ball. I really did, because of, at exam time, so I was taking 16 courses. That's a lot of courses. So, now when I think about it, I think it's ridiculous, right? So what happened then was I went to the resident director. Do you remember those, if you ever lived in a residence where they were like, we thought they were like psychologists, but they were really like 1 year older than you were, and they got like $5 extra or something? Right, anyway, so I went to her and said, I'm really in trouble here. She said, oh, I know what you mean. You need drugs. You really need drugs. So she took me to this, girl who sold drugs out of shoeboxes and said she needs a pill to do Paradise Lost. Like, she's got 12 books to read here. It's a big deal. So I locked myself in my room with this large green pill that cost us $5, which is a lot of money back then. It was a week's worth of food. So I took the pill, and began reading Paradise Lost, and it gave me the idea of never ever take a pill again, because I can still remember large passages from Paradise Lost, and I was having the best time in my room reading this. And so I was going to write a paper on the air. This takes a little bit of chutzpah, but I was writing a paper on where God went wrong. So I was reading it, and it said that the snake who was talking to Adam and Eve lost his you'll appreciate this, having gone to Catholic school, where the snake was getting punished for delivering the message to Adam and Eve because he lost his legs and then had to forever slither. So I thought, hey, you're punishing the messenger, man. This is not fair, right? So because I was on this drug, I actually began to become enraged about this. I just was wild with anger, and I decided to not write a paper, but to write book 13 of Paradise Lost, and I did it in iambic pentameter from the point of view of a paraplegic snake. So it was. It turned out there was a professor there who was visiting from Oxford, and he actually liked it. And he said, "Why don't you come to Oxford?" And I said, "No, I'm very involved in civil rights here." And then my friend, another friend from high school, said to me, "Are you crazy? You're in trouble. You don't get how much trouble you're in with the FBI, and there's a murder trial. You better get out of Dodge, buddy." So I went to England. So now we're starting the third book. And it's called Coming Ashore, which is the one that's just come out. And it's about my life in England at Oxford. And now I know, Jill, you're from London, so you know what it was like in 1968 to 70. And I loved Oxford. I thought it was great. But my mother said, "Look, when you're there, just don't do bad things, right? Because you've just gotten in so much trouble." I said, "No, I totally get it. I don't want to, that's the worst thing in the world. I don't want to do anything like that." So I rented a bike on the first day. And, because Oxford has different colleges, and you have to drive around to go to your courses. So it was a, sort of a Scottish, guy telling me how to run the brakes, etc. But I couldn't understand a word he said. So he was going, "And I'll tell you what you mean now, little lady, and if you do this." And I thought, what? So I just got on the bike, drove away, and then put my brakes on. And the second I got my brakes on, I realized there were no brakes because the brakes were on the front of the bike, which I didn't realize. They were English brakes. This is before people had bikes that were like from England. Nobody had those kind of bikes. I flew through the office window and broke it. And of course, this is England, and you'll appreciate this. I mean, if this is America, they'd call an ambulance, right? Right. But in England, just postmaster said, "Oh, special delivery." That was it. I just lay on the floor, and then people just looked at me. Two little old ladies from Oxford said, "Cutting in line. Americans always cutting in line." Right? I mean, nobody did anything. I still have a huge scar on my face, on the side of my head. So when I went back to my professor, because at Oxford you have a one-to-one meeting with your professor. That's one of the reasons you do all your work, right, when you're at Oxford, because you can't hide in a classroom. You're one-to-one with this guy every day, so you've got to do the reading, right? So I'm sitting with him in his office, and I look like a forceps delivery. I've got a huge point on the top of my head. I've got my entire eye inside here is all shut. He never mentions it. We talk about Coleridge. He never says one word. Right? So I realized, wow, I am in a completely different country. Does any of this surprise you? No, not a bit. Right. So, and I made terrible mistakes when I was in England. I would say, they'd say, "Are you a scholarship student?" And I'd say, "Yes. Yeah, I am. I'm a scholarship student." Because, in America, is there anything better than being a scholarship student? Nothing, right? It's the best you can do, right? Well, not true there. If you're a scholarship student, it means they'd say things like, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that," because that means you didn't go into the regular hierarchy. You didn't go to Eton. You're not from the good families where you wound up at Oxford. So being a scholarship student means you're a bit, as my boyfriend, Clive Hunter Parsons' mother said. She's very lovely, our little Kathy, but she's a bit of an upstart. Yeah. So, and then people would say things like, "Pardon me," when I would say something. And to me, "pardon me" means I should repeat it because they didn't understand it. But in England, pardon me means that's so offensive, don't ever say it again, right? So they'd say, pardon me, and I'd say, yeah, I meant, blah, 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 and I would say the whole thing again. And I mean, the whole thing about England was constantly trying to figure out where you were in the social hierarchy. That was absolutely crucial. And that's why they can't stand Americans. Part of it is because they're loud and annoying and make big deals about what they think is nothing. But they don't like that. When you speak, I mean in England, when you speak, you can say less than a sentence and people know where you're from, they know your they've got everything figured out. But in America, when you have this American accent, they don't know where you're from. So they spend a huge amount of time trying to figure it out. Right? When I went to Clive Hunter Parsons' home, he had a Downton Abbey knockoff. His mother was in a driveway waiting for us. Right? Her name was Wiggles. Right? I know. I mean, here they are, these formal people, and they all had weird little names. The husband's name. Anyway, they all had bizarre little names. So when I got there, the nanny was there too. His nanny, who had previously been Wiggles' nanny, was there. Right? She was about 99, and she said, "Oh, I'm so happy to see you." Her name. This could only happen in England. Her name was, and I swear to God, you couldn't make this up. Titty. He went, "Titty, hi." I was like, "Whoa, stop that right now!" Right? Yeah. I mean, it was. You've heard this name before, right? It's bizarre, isn't it? Okay, so it's fine. She said, "Oh, now exactly what does your father do?" And I said, "He's a pharmacist." She goes, "Hey, that's a sort of tradesman, isn't it?" And I said, "Sort of." And she said, "And where are you from exactly?" And I said, "America. You know that, America." And she said, "Well, I mean, regionally, where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm Irish American." She goes, "Oh, I'm so happy because we'll get along beautifully. Because you see, I know everything about the Irish. Because I don't know if you've met Darby or not, but here he is. Darby is their dog, who's Irish. He's an Irish wolfhound, right? Yeah. So I mean, finally, I realized I got to get out of England, right? So I left England, but I mean, there's a lot that goes on in that. I'd say that's more. There's a good third of the book about England. And about sort of what it's like to be in swinging London and Jimi Hendrix. Lots comes up. But then I left and I came back here and I got the horrible realization that I have to student teach to get that horrible teaching certificate that I didn't want. So I thought, well, here's what I could do. Cleveland at that point was burning. Right, it was burning to the ground. Do any of you remember that? Cleveland in 19... Well, that's great, because I'm from Canada. Whenever I mention Cleveland burning, they go, "Wow, is that happening now? I'll get on the news," right? Yeah, so this is what in 1968, 69. So I thought, well, it'd be interesting to go there. I mean, why not go there? Because it's a moment in history which we'll never have again, right? So I decided to go to, and I was at John Adams High School. Since you're from Cleveland, I had to give it another name, right? So, and I lived at the Alcazar, which you said, "You've got to be kidding." Right? I lived in a really weird place. So, I went to teach, and it was an all-black high school. And the police took you in. That's one of the things they guaranteed you, that there'd be a policeman that would take you from your car inside every day. And then there were things in the hall called mice. And they were Puerto Rican. For some reason, all Puerto Rican. They were little gray outfits. And they were little, so we called them the mice. The kids called them the mice. And they had little wands, which I found out were tasers, little tasers. So there were big notes on above the bulletin board that said, "Never call the office. If anyone misbehaves, call the mice." Right? So you'd go out, and the mice would come in, and you'd take one of them out, taser them, and throw them back in. Right? It's amazing that you never read about this or hear it. I mean, I don't think it was like a taser that they have at the airport to, calm people, but it was definitely something because they were afraid of it. So what I found fascinating when I was there was that they couldn't read. They couldn't read a word. That's not the fascinating part. But they couldn't read a whole sentence. They stumbled over everything. And these were seniors in high school. I said, "What have you been doing for the last, 8-10 years? I don't even get it." They had no books, right? My roommate, her father was a rich plastic surgeon in New York, And so I told him on the phone one time that they had no books. And so he bought all the books for them, and he bought a whole pile of stuff. So I took it all in. They were thrilled to have these books, and so we read Steinbeck, but they had trouble with it, reading. So when I said, okay, let's try poetry. So when I did poetry, I let them vote on their favorite poet. We did a lot of modern black poets, and they went, nah, no, hate that, terrible. Their favorite poets were 19th century, and they loved Edgar Allan Poe. Loved Edgar Allan Poe. They loved everything that had a really firm rhythm. And this is pre-rap, right? But they would, they'd say, I'm weak and weary, and then the girls would stand behind and go, nevermore. So we did a whole assembly with all of this stuff, right? But I would say, why can you not read the word ponder in an essay? But you have no trouble at all when, and with any word that that has a firm beat, And they said, well, I asked them all. One guy stood up and he said, Miss McClure, you know what? Have you ever seen white people dance? Because it's tragic. It's so sad. Because he said they don't even get how to do this, right? Because they don't hear the rhythm. They learn these steps somehow, and then they try to do the steps, but they don't do the rhythm first. He said, we're like that with reading. You've got to hear the beat and then the words. And it doesn't work the other way. So I thought, wow, that is really interesting. So I got the superintendent of schools, and we did this whole assembly, and I wrote a paper on this, and and I would say, okay, now I'm going to present a new poem, so they wouldn't think that I had made them memorize this poem, right? So a new poem, sure enough, they could read it without any problem. So I wrote a paper on this, and I got into huge amounts of trouble for racial profiling. So anyway, that all went down the tubes. So I left Cleveland. At the end of my student teaching. But I learned a huge amount about teaching. I realized it's really easy to teach and be a bad teacher, but the hardest job in the world is to be a good teacher. Way harder than anything I could ever do. So from there, how are we doing for time?
You're getting close to your half hour, but I'd say keep going.
No, I'm just going to say. So then from there, I moved to Toronto. I did an MA, I was going to do a PhD in Coleridge in English literature. My mother said, I'm so glad you are moving to Canada. I mean, I am so glad. They haven't done anything there since the War of 1812, right? There's never anything bad that happens. There's no racial thing that goes on. Nothing happens there. Even you can't get in trouble in Canada. I said, I know. Like, it's nothing. I couldn't get in trouble there. So I lived in a rooming house, and they were all French Canadians. One of them had done a PhD on the history of the Great Lakes, and he was always whispering to his friends. So I said, are you hiding a Great Lake? Like, what's your big secret here? Like, I don't even get what you're going on about. So anyway, one night I was awakened by the police, and they were the FLQ. I don't know if you remember this or not, but there was a Quebec separatist movement, and they actually killed 3 Canadian ministers, and so that was sort of a huge thing that happened in Canada. So I was arrested with them, right? So it was it was interesting, because when I woke up I thought, oh my God, I know that I have rights, but try to put yourself back to being 21, right? Where you have rights, like, oh, I know I have rights, but I'm not quite sure what they are, right? So I said, okay, you can do this, that's fine, but you cannot, I will not be interrogated without food. I don't know why. So I'm the only person that's ever been interrogated at a fast food restaurant. I should have said a lawyer, right? But I didn't really get that part. I knew it was something, but I didn't quite know what it was, right? So anyway, after they finally decided I hadn't committed the crime, and I came back, and all of my stuff had been lined up along the street, all of my books, and I'm a book collector. Because it was an Eastern European landlord, and they were terrified of police, right? So he took everything I owned and put it on the sidewalk, boxed up. So it was 3:30 in the morning. So, what do you do when you're 21 and it's 3:30 in the morning? I sat down and had a cigarette. And so as I was doing this, a guy walked along in black curly hair, looked a little sinister, with 2 German shepherds. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm homeless, actually. I don't have a home. And he said his name was Ginger. And I said, wow, usually Ginger, you have red hair. Your hair's black. And he said, I'm called Ginger because I snap. Wow, okay, I didn't realize that. So then he said, well, he looked around and he said, I live 4 doors north. There's a huge college there, which was an experimental college, and it had turned into a drug warren. It was described, and I have articles in the book, it was described as the biggest drug holding cell for drugs in North America. I didn't know this at the time, and he said, I live in an ashram. I said, are they in India? Right? And he said, no, I've got 9 rooms. He said, you can have 3 if you want, I'll call my flunkies to come down and pick up your stuff. So I thought, I gotta do something. I gotta live somewhere. So I did. So a big part of the book is talking about Ginger and about what my life was like with Ginger. I mean, we had no relationship other than living together. But I found out Ginger really wanted me to live there because he wanted to use my books. He wanted to put books in every room so that he could keep drugs in there, and then he could say that in fact students lived there. And then he had phony names in the rental office for those guys. Right? So I lived for 2 years free, and I kept going down to the office and saying, I have to pay rent. And they said, no, you're messing up our books. Right? So yeah, so I mean, it was interesting because I got to watch him develop. He was very disturbed in his interpersonal relationships. But he's a good businessman, right? So I just related to him as a businessman, and we wound up getting along quite well. But and then but I describe what happens to him, and there, of course, there's a tragedy in all of that. And then the last third of the book, and what goes through the book all the way through, is academia. I think part of the reason I didn't get in too much trouble was because I was always working on some kind of degree or something, and I felt determined to finish it. I was at one point a neuropsych, and I know you all read this book, right? When you were little, didn't you all read those books that talked about the lives of famous people, like Louisa May Alcott's biography? Didn't you read that? Yeah, right. And you read. And my favorite was Madame Curie. Remember the Madame Curie biography? I loved that book. So I wanted to be like a Madame Curie, and I wanted a white outfit with it said McClure on it. It was what I really wanted. So I wound up in a lab, and I was doing all kinds of research. But I realized, it's really boring to be with mice all day long, right? All day long, for year in and year out. And then you write a little paper where you move this much, you move science ahead this much. It was so boring that I made little red Speedo bathing suits out of construction paper for my mice. Right? And when the professor came in and he said, who did the Speedos? And I said it was me, and he said, maybe you should think of something else, right? So I then started realizing I wanted to do a big picture thing, right? So I did Darwin's Influence on Freud. It wound up being 2 volumes that they had to bind in for my PhD. But I was interested in instinct, and I wanted to know what the instinct was psychologically and also biologically. Anyway, I won't get into all of that, but I think that the point of this book is that this is the happiest time of my life, right? And you know what the worst thing about the happiest time of your life, the best time of your life, what's the worst thing? You don't know it, right? You don't know it. Like later you go, oh my God, that was the best time of my life, right? But you don't know it when you're having it, right? And for me, the best time is that you get to, when you go to a dinner party and it's totally boring and you go, oh my God, do I have to talk to this person for all night? It's so unbelievable. I was locked in an office all day with Darwin and Freud, 2 of the most fascinating people of the last 2 centuries, right? My life was fascinating, And the other thing is I don't know about you, but do you remember that time before you were married, before you had children, before you had a job, and you got to discover what the world was? Like you were not you weren't the donkey dragging around the globe, You were the one that got to say, oh wow, how does that work, and how does that work? And it's the only time in your life where you don't have any other responsibilities other than figuring out what makes the world. And I sort of talk about that as we weave through the book, and it's. It's hard to go back and relive that. So I wanted to make sure that it came across in the book. Anyway, I'm going to turn this over to you and see if you have any questions.
May we applaud you first?
Oh yeah.
So any questions?
I should have had a plant.
I was going to say to you, because we were talking about this before, Robin Williams, and you have the classic stand-up comics background,
Which is?
which is, you know, messed up family, you know, weird things with your parents, strange men in your life, and you know, a lot of things that you know, we were talking about in stand-up comics, you know, depression, and they've got usually really messed up childhoods, Catholic or otherwise. So you check a lot of those boxes.
See, the irony is I didn't think I had a messed up childhood. I thought I had this totally happy childhood, which, you know, but other people say, are you kidding? That wasn't a happy childhood, right? You know, so yeah, I mean, I guess that's true.
So if the writing dries up, go on the road.
Yeah, go on the road. yeah, right. Take the writing on the road. There's another one. Yeah, there's another one. Yeah.
I think you owe it to the audience. You have to just tell them that quick little story about delivering drugs to Marilyn Monroe and your finger froze. And
Oh yeah.
Oh, for heaven's
Yeah,
sake.
yeah.
yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
My goodness.
I know. Only men like this story. Okay, it's true. It's true. Yeah, when I go to boys' schools and things, they like this story. Okay, when I don't know if you know the movie Niagara, which Marilyn Monroe made in 1955. Well, it was made across from my father's drugstore. And one of the things we all know is that Marilyn Monroe needs a lot of medication, right? And, you know, so when Marilyn Monroe came to Niagara Falls, I mean, there was, you know, the area was cordoned off by policemen, and, you know, it was just wild. You know, she was, I think, still married to Joe DiMaggio. And so it was interesting because actually, I'm going to talk about this on two levels. Just one of them is the content. The content is Marilyn Monroe, which is interesting. But the other thing is I'm teaching a course on writing and on how to write a memoir, a childhood memoir. And one of the things, the questions I say to all of them is, when do you realize sex exists? Right? Not your first sexual experience. That's boring, and it should probably be after the book or sometime. But right, but. You know, when you realize, wow, something is happening in the world that my parents aren't telling me about, you know, because it is weird when you think about it, right? There's a whole thing, and, you know, babies come from storks and, you know, da-da-da-da-da. So this whole Marilyn Monroe thing, I thought, wow, you know, she's a movie star, and this is hugely exciting. And then my father said, oh, don't worry, I'll deliver that medication to you. Right? I said, no way, we are the delivery people, right? No. But I remember thinking, that's very odd. You know, that, you know, he would sort of step out from being the pharmacist to do this. And I said to my mother, Dad wanted to deliver it. She went, he did? So I remember, like, I just remember there was a lot of tension around the Marilyn Monroe thing. And we had to go to her room because she has to sign the narcotics log. If you get a narcotic, she has to sign for it. So you can't give it to somebody to give to her, right? So she has handlers, right? As you know, as we all know. So we went to the door, and she answered the door in a bra and slip. Yeah. So, I mean, to a little kid in 1955 when I was 6, I said, there's a man here. So, yeah, you know, so it was, and also she had chip nail polish and dark roots. I thought, trashy. This is so trashy. Because, you know, that's what you did. I mean, those are the terms you used then. I said, wow, like, this is the person? And also, she wasn't nice to me. Right? She wasn't, you know, wasn't nice. You know, usually people are like, oh, little girl, hey, come on. And she was like, where's the signature? Where do I sign? You know, she wasn't polite. But when she saw Roy, it was a whole different thing, right? She said, you know, could you come back tonight, please, and bring photo play and some juicy fruit? And I said, we don't deliver photo play and juicy fruit. We deliver medication, right? What's wrong with her, right? And Roy said, oh, I could do it. Not a problem, right? And then when we got in the elevator, we always agreed on things, and we always imitated people. And I did imitations, and he laughed, and vice versa. Right. So I'd say, oh, isn't she appalling? She was the worst. And I said, she was in a bra. And he said, oh, well, I thought it was an evening gown. I said, are you kidding? That was trashy. That was terrible. That was awful. And he said, you know what? It just didn't bother me. Right. So I got this, my first inkling, something was very odd that I wasn't understanding in the world, you know, because, you know, my mother said you could never wear Bermuda shorts to the post office. It's trashy, right? So I mean, here's a woman in a bra and underpants answering the door, right? So and this, you know, in that scene is has always stayed with me, partly because it was Marilyn Monroe, but another part because it was so, it's the opposite of what people told me was good. yet people were lining up around the block to see her, right? And and I would say, I dined out of the story. Well, I'm still dining out of the story, right? And I would say, we saw Marilyn Monroe, and every man in the group would go, what? Even the priest, I'd say, hey, we delivered medicine to Marilyn Monroe, and he'd say, I want every detail. So it just was really odd to me. But the other thing about it is I gave a talk in a school. I do this once in a while because if you go to a private school, they'll buy 60 books and then those kids have to read them, right? So I do it often. So not one boy in this school, in this all-boys school, or in an all-girls school, had heard of Marilyn Monroe.
Catholic
Yeah.
school.
Yeah, and when you think about it, she's 2 generations removed.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you'd have to watch really old movies. But I thought, wow, I mean, she's sort of iconic, right? But I read the Marilyn Monroe section aloud to them. I thought they would really like it. But they were like, they did not know who it was. And there isn't one person that they knew in Coming Ashore, except for Jimi Hendrix. Everybody knew Jimi Hendrix and loved him. They went, Jimi Hendrix, they went wild.
Yeah.
But all the other people they didn't know. And I said, well, I was trying to explain to them, because they have to write memoirs. I was trying to say, look, you have to pick iconic times and then you write around them what was happening. Like I said, mine was in After the Falls was the death of Kennedy, the death of John Kennedy, right? I said, so what would you write? I said to these grade 11 kids left. This is Canada, remember, as well. But I said, what would be an iconic thing? What would be like that for you to write? And they all of them said Trayvon Martin. Yeah, so, yeah, very interesting. I said, wow, and they all agreed right away that was their iconic thing. So then the teacher told me that after I left, they all decided they were going to write what they were doing, and they're, because they all remembered, just the way we remembered about Kennedy, where we were and what we were, and to them, that was huge. They're a huge thing. Yeah, I know, really interesting. Yeah.
Okay, I know you're a psychologist for 25 good years, right? And you saw
Till I ran out of empathy.
all kinds of very, like, sex offenders, all kinds
Yeah.
of crazy, and normal.
Yeah, I liked forensic. That was one of my favorites.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. But, I mean, is the practice of writing a memoir, it sounds like it's something would be very therapeutic for anyone to think about doing.
Yeah, and I actually, on 2 levels I'm going to answer that. One of them is when I wrote Too Close to the Falls. Look, what happens is Roy, I was very close to, probably closer than, I spent more time, I logged more time with Roy than I did with my parents. And then one day he disappeared. 2 mafia members took him away. I guess he owed money. Never saw him again. Well, I just gave that book away. But anyway, so he was gone. And you remember what parents were like in the 50s, and probably now. Well, I don't know about now, but I'd say, when's Roy coming back? I would say, every day I'd say, isn't Roy coming back? And my father would always say, I think Roy would want us to move on. Roy would want us to, not carry on. The whole idea of not carrying on really meant stuff it in and shove it down, right? So when I wrote this chapter, I found I was sobbing by the end of it, right? And I had no idea that this actually meant so much to me, right? But by the end, I was beside myself, So and then for the next book, where my father had a brain tumor, and it was my job to hold it together. And I had to get a job at Howard Johnson's. I had to get a job. I had 3 jobs. I had to do stuff. So I didn't have time to mourn the loss of my father. I just didn't have the time. And then of course he wound up being very angry at me. Even at his death, he was very angry at me because he thought that I had taken things away from him, which I had. But I didn't have time to feel badly about that. But in the writing, it came out how I really did feel about it. Because all of the things that happen in your life, sometimes you don't have a chance. Your parents don't allow you to, or you don't allow yourself to, to do that. So to mourn them, or to really have those feelings. So you're absolutely right. And then I got very involved in watching, I suppose, this is a big confession, Orange is the New Black. I got watching that on whatever, and I just stayed up till like 4 in the morning and watched all of the episodes. So I got interested, and I said, I'm going to call a prison and offered to do a memoir course, because that would be a really good idea, like, because journaling does help people. It does help people to put stuff out, right? Because it forces you to deal with how you really feel, right? So they read two of my books, because the third one wasn't out yet, and then it went all the way up the chain of command, and they said, no, we think that you could be a little subversive. We don't think you'd be good for the people here. Which was a little offensive, but I said, really? That's really interesting, because I've had so many people from prison libraries write to me, male and female. I said, so they said, no, because, there's like your FBI stuff, and there's, you kind of glorify being on the other side of the law. I said, really? Well, that is your interpretation of that? And they said, yes, it is. So I was turned down for that. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Any other questions? One last question, we'll call it a wrap. Yeah?
What is your next project?
Oh, right, okay.
I wish it was another memoir.
Yeah, no more memoirs. My three sons have said they do not want to see themselves interpreted through my eyes, right? So my next project is nonfiction, yet again. And it's, I think when I left my private practice, I was so sort of burned out that I didn't want to think about my practice at all anymore. And now that I've been away from it for 10 years, I'm sort of missing it. I'm realizing all the things I really liked about it. I'm going to do a book on the people that I've had who've had the most tragic, awful lives. Yet they've emerged in one piece, and they've taken everything they had, and they found a way to get through it all. Sort of, and I got really riled up because a kid from our high school, I think you all know who I name, right from high school. He got the what's that Medal of Honor where you go to meet the president? Mm-hmm. Yeah, he got that for something he did in Iraq, and I thought, wow, like you just did that for one day. But look at people that like have to get up every day and live through torture, and then they got to live the next day, right? I mean, I'm just thinking of one who is left. Just to give you an idea, one of them is left with 3 children. Father says he's going for cigarettes, doesn't come back, and she's 9, and one's 7, and one's 5, and she actually managed it for a year and a half till she got caught. She stole food every day, but she needed to find a way to parent, so she watched. She had a TV, so she watched. They were left in a cabin. And she watched MASH, and she watched Colonel Potter. She made Colonel Potter the father, her father. And he would always give advice, and she listened to that advice, and she said, okay, that's going to be my father, and I'm going to be, and she started dreaming of Colonel Potter, and disappointing Colonel Potter, and he really got turned into the father, right? So I want to write about people that just reached out into the world somehow and made their life better instead of victims. Yeah. And I want to thank you for coming today.
Oh, it was awesome.
It's our pleasure.